Welcome to the lecture for Friday, September 26th. I'm just going to kind of introduce this topic, of logic and go through it and give you some terms and stuff to think about. Okay. Um, so the first thing to say is logic is going to connect with what we've already been talking about with Descartes. All right, and I want to just sit with that for a little bit. So we've already been talking a bunch with Descartes about this concept of the structure of the mind. That he was very much, you won't even say obsessed with ensuring that his thoughts were properly organized, that he was the one that had planned out what his mind was going to be like. He wanted to make sure that his ideas connected well together, right? That they were built up properly, and that there was some sort of recognizable pattern or order to it. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't random. It didn't just happen. He wanted to avoid the situations where, say, like a city had been built and then it other things were added to it and added to it, but there was no overall design or blueprint to that, or a house where people kept building on different parts of it and it ended up being kind of chaotic and disorganized and messy. He wanted to make sure that he could look into the way his mind was operating, look into the structure of his mind and see, okay, there's a recognizable format and design to this. This makes sense. I can see where I got from point A to point B to point C. I can see how certain things build off of each other. He wants to make sure, of course, that there's a very solid foundation. We talked a lot about foundationalism. We talked about the importance of that. And we talked about how you have to go in a kind of step by step fashion built based off of that solid foundation. You have to proceed slowly. You have to make sure that every step along the way is being done correctly as you're building up these structure of your mind in this manner. Um, and of course, the house and the city analogies, like I talked about, they provide a lot of good ways of thinking about this. If you're going to build a house, you want to be the one who's building it from the foundation upward. You want to make sure that foundation is really, really solid. You want to make sure that then the first story of the house is built off of that foundation and it's based on it and it connects really well. And then you put up the siding and then the second story, etc. And if you're going to design a city, you want it to be laid out well. You want it to be in a very recognizable pattern. I mean, Great Falls is actually a good example of this because for the most part, a lot of it is in a grid pattern. It's pretty easy to recognize and navigate in the city for that reason. Another thing, of course, to bring up is the mathematical relevance to this. So we talked about this in class, that example I think I drew up of, you can imagine a right angle triangle within a circle, and that if you figure out that one of the legs of the triangle is 4 and the other leg is 5, well, that means the hypotenuse would have to be, oh, if one of the legs is 4 and the other is 3, the hypotenuse has to be 5 because a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So you know that is necessarily true. You know that it has to be the case. And then once, if you can imagine the hypotenuse being from the center of the circle to the edge of the circle, that gives you the radius of the circle, and you get the diameter, you can get the area, and you get the circumference. So you can build up in that step by step way, and each step along the way, you know that you're getting something that's true, and it's also necessarily true. It can't be otherwise. And if you proceed in the right way, you continue to you build up further ideas that all have to be true, but you have to follow the kind of step by step organization or pattern or structure. So, insofar as we're thinking about a structure or a design, and one which allows us to come to see things clearly and necessarily is true, one which works well, it can be replicated. Remember Descartes saying he has a discourse on method. What is the method that he's using? Um, that's going to give you a good initial overview of what logic is about. I want to just speak on that a little bit more because sometimes logic is a term that can be used in a lot of different ways. But as we're starting to see with Descartes, one of the things it fundamentally means is organizing our minds, our thoughts in a proper fashion, in a proper order, etc., and ensuring that the flow of our thoughts or the progression of our thoughts ties together well, analogous to how the parts of a house would tie together well. Okay, so let me just go to the second slide. We recall with Descartes, he wanted to do this so that he could ensure that he was having true and useful ideas. Because just remember this from Descartes, right? He wanted to he thought that in the time period that he lived, there were a lot of different ideas. It was hard to know which were true and which were false. It was hard to know which could be doubted and which were not doubtable, which were necessarily the case and which you could have a lot of doubts about. And the first thing to say is he wanted to organize his mind properly in order to know the truth. It wasn't just an exercise of getting stuff in, getting his thoughts in order just for the sake of getting them in order. He wanted to get them in order because he thought that they could help him to know the truth about the world in a more clear and distinct manner. He wanted to formulate true ideas, right? And he wanted to ensure that these ideas were true because, he said, in one sense, what he's saying is, what's the point of having all of these ideas if they're false? What's the point of having opinions if they turn out not to be true? The mind, he thinks, is oriented toward the truth. The mind comes to it's at its best when it's knowing the truth clearly. It's at its worst when it's not doing that, or it's confused, or it's muddled, or it's not seeing things as they actually are. And so for Descartes, the mind, the method of forming the mind in the right way was done so that at the end of using this method, he could be validated, he could rest assured that he had come to know truth and know it in a much more clear and distinct manner. He wanted to do that also so that he could get to see these truths as necessarily true, not likely true, not possibly true, but necessarily true. That ties us back, of course, to the mathematical-like approach that he's presenting here. So Descartes thinks that the mind is thus should be mirroring the world properly. That's another way I think another analogy we talked about. You don't just want to have ideas, but you want to have ideas that are lined up well with the way things are in the world, so that your mind is grasping the truth of how things actually are. You have ideas that properly reflect the way the world is, that provide insight into the way things are in the world. If you're not doing that, the mind is not being used well, and it's not as if our, what did you call it, good sense at the start of the book, the capacity for understanding and insight is not being brought to its maximal capacity. It's being underdeveloped is another way we could say it. So Descartes says, look, the mind is there to help us know the world, to see it clearly, to know it truly, and to grasp necessary truths about it. And the way that we do that is through, one of the fundamental ways we do that is by organizing and structuring our minds in the right way. So the organization and the structuring of the mind is a task, a method to be followed such that at the end of it, you can see clearly and know truthfully about the world. A final thing, of course, this also helps to do is to differentiate between the true and the false, because the more you know something is true, the more you're able to recognize that what's opposed to that has to be false. So that if I know that 2 + 2 = 4, I know that's a true idea, then I also know that 2 + 3, if somebody says 2 + 3 = 4, I know that's false because it's opposite and different from what is true. So knowing the truth also helps us to see clearly what is false and avoid going down that road. Because if our minds get caught up in falsehood, if our minds get filled with ideas that are false, or we're kind of drawn into that, we're again failing to use our minds in the proper way. We're not putting them into right practice, into right work. Something's gone awry, something's gone amiss, something's off base, as it were. So for Descartes, the structuring of the mind in this organized, designed, deliberate manner is the process by means of which we come to get to the truth. So we have structuring of the mind in order to get to truth. Okay. All of which kind of leads to this point about logical thinking. So very much in line with what we've been saying with Descartes, logical thinking is first and foremost a structured pattern of thought. There's some kind of format to it. There's some sort of recognizable organization. Your ideas fit together. They tie together properly. You can see the progression and how it goes. I just want to pause on that because I think we all have an intuition of this, where somebody says something and it seems like the ideas fit together well and they lead to a further insight. And we can recognize that seems to make sense. That seems logical. But on the other hand, when you're going in an opposite direction, somebody goes in an opposite direction and the ideas don't seem to fit together, they don't flow, they don't seem to lead to insight, you're not sure how you got from point A to point D, as it were, you would say, in that instance, the person seems to be illogical. There's not a logical train of thought. All right, and that's, we use that expression too, a train of thought. So if you think about that for a moment, you can think, okay, what does a train do? Well, it follows on tracks to certain destinations, and then it reaches its terminus, its end point. But you can see how, if you have a map, you can see how it goes. You can see the schedule with which it goes. It makes sense as you follow it along. And an illogical or train of thought is one that doesn't make sense. You can't map out how it got there, and it doesn't fit together well. Another thing to kind of say about logical thinking is that when it's done properly, it tends to lead to further insight so that you can kind of see something more clearly. It's like you follow a couple of ideas and then a third idea develops, and based on that third idea, you're able to have a deeper sense of something. And that's precisely, of course, what Descartes was trying to do, is working his way through this logical process to, for example, demonstrate the existence of God. So he's able to build up from his own mind to prove his existence, to prove the type of thing he is, a res cogitans, and then based on that to recognize, all right, within this mind that I have, there's this idea of God, and the only way that could be there is if God himself has innately placed it within me in a manner that proves not only the goodness of God, but also the existence of God. So that's another example of that. We'll get more into that a little bit later on, but just to see this sense that the structuring of the mind leads to greater insight. Helps direct the mind to see the world clearly. Obviously, I've just been talking about that. You build up the mind well so that you can come to see truth. It acts as a referee or a boundaries. Okay, so it helps to set us on the right track. So if you think about that logical train of thought, you want to make sure the train stays on the tracks. And you can think about when people's thoughts get derailed or they go off track or they lose the train of thought or it doesn't fit. That's when they're not being logical. That's when things aren't, the mind isn't going in the right process, as it were. Another thing to say about logical thinking, just connecting it back with Descartes, it's going to help us build up our thoughts analogous to a properly designed and constructed house or city. I hopefully don't have to say too much more on that, except, you start with the solid foundation with the house and you build up and you complete it with the roof. And the city is one where you know how the city ought to be designed so that traffic flows best, so people can navigate it best, so it's easy to recognize the pattern, etc. And then a final thing to say is that the articulate use of the mind to articulate the world. It helps direct, you're using the mind in the best way so that it properly mirrors the way things are in the world and you can come to understand them. Okay, so that just gives us a kind of initial sense of what logical thinking is about, tying it to Descartes. Again, Descartes has been doing it. We've been doing it when you've been, making points about Descartes, when you've been kind of presenting stuff, I'm sure, on your short papers for the in-class exam, you've been doing logical thinking. This is just, I'm just bringing to further articulation what you've already been doing and just giving it terms, not introducing something radically new. It's sort of teasing out what we've already been doing and bringing it to light and bringing it into new terminology. So just that's another thing to keep in mind, that some of this stuff sounds new, and it is a little bit new, but it's not totally new because you've already been doing it. And Descartes has been doing it, and you're thinking about Descartes, you've been doing it, and you're writing about Descartes, you've already been doing it. So the next term that I need to introduce is the term argument, because there's a specific, particular way this term is used in philosophy. Often we think about argument as people shouting, people screaming at each other. One person wins, another person loses. It's a thing in which it gets very emotional, it's over the top, you want to avoid it. It can disrupt relationships. It can cause lots of stress and acrimony. That's not at all what we're looking at when we think about the term argument in philosophy. When we think about the term argument in philosophy, what we often mean is it's a shorthand term for a logical form of thought. That's all it means. When somebody is thinking properly and in a logical way, that you can kind of assess and evaluate the different steps along the way that lead to their final point, and it's clear what they're saying and how they're saying it, and there's a logical, consistent pattern to that, then that's what we mean by argument. Now, we're going to be going through this a lot over the next week, so don't try to, it might be a bit unclear at this point. If we were in class, I would start going through this a little bit more, but for the moment, just kind of think of it in these terms. It's calm and clear and thoughtful, okay, where you're not trying to shout anybody or shout down anybody, but you're letting the good pattern progression of thought proceed in the right way to come to further insight. Okay, the final thing I want to bring up today are premises and conclusion. Okay, so the conclusion is the end of the argument. It's the roof that completes the house that you've been building with your mind. Let's look at an example in Descartes. Descartes tries to demonstrate the existence of God. The final step in that is to say, and thus God necessarily has to exist. That is the conclusion. That's the ending point. That's what you've been working toward. It's, again, the roof on the house of the mind. It's often can be indicated by terms like thus or therefore. So if you're reading along in something and somebody says there and therefore the blah, 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 that tells you that maybe you've reached a point with a conclusion. Premises are what build up to it. They lead to the conclusion. The conclusion is based on the premises. They're the steps along the way that you've been doing. They're the motion of the train toward the final train station. They're the siding, the foundation levels, and the siding of a house. So if you have proper premises working together, they lead almost easily and fluidly toward the conclusion. It makes sense. You can see what's being said. The main thing is to, at this point, recognize the difference between a premise and a conclusion. So a conclusion is the final point that you've been working toward. The conclusion helps you to get to that final point. Premises should connect well together. You should see how point A relates to point B to point C, which then leads to the final point of D. It should be a recognizable thing. You should see how it ties together. It's like a well-ordered, designed house. You can look at the blueprint and say, okay, I can see how this works together. If you're making a good argument, philosophically speaking, you should be able to look at the premises and think, okay, I can see how this works or ties together. Now, as I'm going to have you do a short assignment for Fridays to make up for Friday's class, the short assignment is I want you to write an argument. I'm going to have this up on Moodle. It should be at least several sentences long and have some sort of conclusion. I'm not expecting a whole lot. Okay, I just want you to practice, practice, practice. But I need everybody to kind of do this, to write an argument with premises and a conclusion. And if it's unclear what that is, that's totally fine because you're just starting this whole practice. You need to get the hang of it. You need to get the feel for it. The only way to do that is to start doing it. So that's going to be the assignment for the makeup for Friday's class. Okay, if anybody has any questions, please let me know. Again, I'm sure there are going to be certain questions. That's fine. We're going to go through this in more detail definitely on Monday and next week. So don't get too worried about it. Otherwise, I'll see everybody on next Monday. Enjoy the time off from class and make sure to watch this video and obviously do the assignment. Thanks. Bye.